There we go. So who's that person I've got on the title page? MLK. So Chance, who is that? Those initials don't mean a whole lot for me.
Martin Luther King Jr.
Okay, Martin Luther King Jr. And if you're not familiar with him, you need to go back to U.S. history. Or those of you who have not had U.S. history, you need to go take U.S. history. Or go to Washington, D.C. You can see that monument. That is one of the newer monuments that's there. Martin Luther King made this statement during the middle of the Civil Rights Movement where he said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." And I see the division going on in our country, and I see so much hate being thrown out there. And as I mentioned a moment ago, on both sides of the argument, that I think that we really need to, as Christians, keep our mindset and our focus on an eternal spectrum, and we need to love people. We need to show them Christ's love, because the heart of this issue and the divisiveness is really man's sin and hatred toward one another. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind. And even as we look at some of the elements in our nation's history that are some pretty bleak moments in history, we need to keep all those things in mind, keep an eternal perspective on it. So we're going to begin here talking about diversity and discrimination in our country and how the legal system has approached this throughout our history and kind of what we're doing today. But it is important that we understand that we are a diverse group of people. We are not one race of people. We're not one culture. It is a big-time mixture. We are continually growing in our diversity. We're not standing still. Every single year when we are looking at the figures, the numbers of who we have in our country, it changes. So I believe your book has a number of statistics regarding our racial composition. I am not going to quiz you over these statistics. However, you should know kind of who is the highest makeup of race in our country and some of the proportions here, but I'm never going to quiz or test you over the percentages. But in the United States, as of 2016, and the numbers that I could find, 61% of the American population is made up of white, non-Hispanic people. That went down 4% from the numbers that I saw in 2007, I think maybe it was 2009. I can't remember when the last time I updated that, but it went down in a matter of less than 10 years, went down about 5% because it's being distributed elsewhere. So you can see there our second highest racial group is Hispanic, almost 18%, Black 13%, Asian American makes up nearly 6%, and Native American only 1.3% of our population today. So we still have a lot of diversity, and because of that, we have a lot of different perspectives on things and a lot of different approaches to things. And unfortunately, our nation is filled with a lot of race-based discrimination. And a lot of times when we think about this topic, our mind immediately goes to the African American discrimination that happened for so long in our country. And while that was a major aspect, and we'll talk about it, it is not the only cultural group that's been discriminated against in our nation's history. And until recently, African Americans were the largest minority in the United States until just the last few years, where Hispanics have taken over as the second largest, or they're the largest minority, the second largest racial group in our country. So that is a more recent change. So African Americans have probably suffered the most discrimination of any racial group in our country. And of course, we know a lot about the Civil War, Civil Rights Movement, and we'll talk a little bit about the Civil Rights Movement a little bit later on. Native Americans also have a very sad history in the United States. As America expanded, what happened to Native American population? What did we do? We killed them, yes. What else did we do? Took their land. What did we offer them in return? Money. Okay, we did offer them some money. What other kind of treatments do we have with the Native Americans in our American history? Give me some examples. What are some things that we did besides we took their land, we killed them, we gave them money for that land sometimes? Give me some specific examples. Reach back into that U.S. history you did. David?
French and Indian War and the Trail of Tears.
Okay, two good examples there with French and Indian War and the Trail of Tears. So how did the Americans treat, well, let's back off from the French and Indian War just because the United States did not exist at that point. That was still more British. But let's use the Trail of Tears. Give me some background information. How were they treated in the Trail of Tears? Doesn't sound very good just by the name. Trail of Tears, what happened? Kicked them out of where? Out of their homeland. They had lived there longer than we had been there. And why do we do that? Because we wanted their land. They wouldn't give it to us. So we said, we will provide you with new land, right? So where did they move? Oklahoma. Okay, so we set aside reservations in Oklahoma. We said, you can have this land. It is yours. And then what happened a few years later? Did they stay in Oklahoma? When all of a sudden the settlers began moving westward, remember the Oklahoma land rushes? You guys talk about that in U.S. history? Are we awake today? Not talk about that in U.S. history? We did. Yeah, I thought maybe. So we're trying to give away the Oklahoma land, but we had a problem because there were people there. There were the Native Americans there. So what do we do with the Native Americans? We moved them again. Where did we move them this time? Not this time. Well, there were some that did move further west. Where'd they go? Dakotas. Yeah, moved them north. In an area that we so wonderfully named the Badlands. We said, here, have this. Then what happens? After we put them in the Badlands, then what do we find? Do we let them stay there? No. Why not? You ever heard of Black Hills gold? It's pretty expensive and it's used in a lot of jewelry. We find out that there's gold in the Badlands in the Dakotas, and we just gave that land to the Indians, but man, there's gold there. We really want that, so let's move again. Away you go. We'll find some other corner of the continent that we don't want, and we'll give it to you. So, I am a little bit sad that we don't have more time to go into Native American history and America's treatment of them based off of, it seems like we might have missed some of that previous conversation. So, America's treatment of Native Americans is not very good. And unfortunately, we have not done a whole lot to change that. Instead of allowing them to be part of their own culture, we force them to assimilate. What does that word assimilate mean? Am I really asking really hard questions today? Are we just that out of it? Yeah, I know David's going to throw out an answer just because he feels like, all right, I feel bad for this guy up there asking questions and nobody's answering, so I guess I'll answer. But this should not be just David and I having conversation here. So is it just, today's a rough day and it's a long week? Okay, all right. If I know that ahead of time, then I will start calling on people. So No. What does assimilate mean? What does it mean to assimilate? Bethany? Yeah, become part of that society. And so we told the Native Americans, you're welcome to live with us, but you got to be like us. We didn't want them to be part of their own culture, have their own language, their own religious views. We said, we're going to make an exception for you, even though we have religious freedom, not for you. And unfortunately, that causes them to go elsewhere. That causes them to go into depression. Not a great history there. With Hispanic Americans, now we don't necessarily classify them as a race, but they're united by a common language. And they are the largest minority group in America today. Many Hispanics come to the United States as refugees because they are seeking a better life than what they had at home. And typically they're going to belong to one of four groups. It's not always this, but typically they'll be Mexican Americans, maybe Cuban Americans, Puerto Ricans would be involved, would be classified in this group, as well as somebody that comes from Central or South America. They'll be part of this group. Then we also have Asian Americans. This is the fastest growing minority group today. The fastest growing minority group coming to the United States right now is Asian Americans. And even if we were to look at just Hawaii, Hawaii has, they are a majority group in Hawaii today. There's a lot of diversity in Hawaii, but they become majority. Now, if we're look beyond the racial issues, we've also had a history of discrimination regarding gender in our country. Yeah, gender equality is a big tagline today in the United States. We're not necessarily going to go into that gender issue today, but when it comes to population, do you know ladies actually outnumber the men in this country? So guys, when you say I can't find a date, just keep looking. All right, she's out there. Trust me. Somewhere she is out there. So women outnumber the men in the United States, and historically, not only in American culture, but around the world, women have lacked many of the same rights as what men have had. And that has only changed really within the last 100 years, where we have seen more equality pushed in most of our major nations. What do we call the women who fight for rights or who want equality? What's the term that we give to them? Especially when it's dealing with voting rights. Okay, they're part of the women's rights movement. When they're pushing for voting, there's a term that we use for them.
I saw that somewhere.
Not necessarily. I get where you're coming from, but that's not necessarily the term we use when they're just fighting or when they're demanding their rights. That's going a little bit further. I want to stop short of using the term feminist. We use the term suffragette. Maybe that's not a term that's common in your vocabulary today, but this would be the women that were wanting equality, that were wanting their right to vote, when they saw that they were an equal part of society, but yet they did not have ability to organize their rights together to collectively have a stronger impact on society. And in spite of the progress we've made over the last 100 years, there are still many areas in our society that women lack the same representation as men. Congress is one of those areas where if you were to look at the numbers, there are fewer women serving in Congress than men. That poses the question, should we have a 50-50 rule? Should we require that one senator out of every two, so the state of Indiana gets 2 senators, one has to be male, one has to be female? It what? How so?
Because you need to make a rule to make it.
Okay. All right. David?
I think sometimes, especially in that case of having a rule to have equal,
Mm-hmm.
well, it takes away some of the qualifications
Mhm.
university, so they just accept a bunch of international students without actually having maybe meet the qualifications as much. So
Okay.
we just like say, okay, we need to have this number and this number. It would eliminate, okay, are they actually qualified?
I think I would tend to agree with your point there because I want the most qualified person to be serving as my senator or the most qualified person to be my president. I don't care whether it's a man or woman. That is not something you can legislate. That is not something you can mandate by a rule. That is something in the mindset of the American people that really needs to change. And while there are some people that would say, well, we have to tell people how to think, we are then eliminating their freedom of um, freedom of choice there. So, um, personally, I think that's where we need to get to. Choose the right person, regardless of their gender. I don't know that everybody's there yet. Now, in the Constitution, it talks about equal protection. And so we're going to spend a few moments here talking about the Equal Protection Clause and what that means. And so I think we've referenced this to some extent. We've talked about the 14th Amendment. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I do think it's worthwhile. So first of all, I need to mention here, equality of condition is impossible, that you cannot make everybody equal. We cannot all drive the same car. We cannot all have the same house. We cannot all get the same paycheck. Unless we want to eliminate all of our freedoms and we want to have a very closed society, no freedoms, then we're not going to be able to have that. Unless we want to go to a communist state or military state, that's impossible with the way we have that. People are naturally given different abilities. Some of you are extremely talented in areas that I would never survive in that workforce or in that field. Others of you, you only get up in front of people and talk when you are forced to and mandated by the teacher. You would never consider a job or vocation that would cause you to stand in front of students every single day, yet that's something that I love to do. So we all have different abilities, different interests, and we all have different circumstances. So trying to legislate equality condition, never going to happen, nor should it in a free society. We also, with freedom of opportunity, this is provided for us through our free market system, that we want to make sure that we have a free opportunity for everybody to make money, to be able to make decisions on their own, but yet we can't mandate how they're going to do that. And then equality of persons. This is not specifically outlined in that phrase in the Constitution, but it's inferred. And the 14th Amendment does talk about equal protection of the laws. And so this is where we get that idea from. And it was intended originally to deal with the freed slaves from having state persecution, but now has been applied to everybody. And so the Fifth Amendment also addresses this a little bit, but it protects the American people here from any unreasonable discrimination. And this is discrimination here regarding the federal government, that we cannot make a unreasonable discrimination. Wow, that went way farther than I meant to. There we go. Any sort of unreasonable discrimination is not allowed by our government. So that brings up the question here. So what is reasonable? How do we define or how do we talk about what is reasonable discrimination? If the government's allowed to do that, what would qualify as reasonable discrimination? And so let's move on and talk about that. By the way, if I am going too quickly, you can download these slides off of Canvas. You can have access to those and go back to them later on should you miss anything that we're talking about here. So the Congress does have this power and ability to classify people into different groups for a number of reasons. That is considered reasonable. So when we take a survey and it asks you on that survey, what is your race? That is classifying people. The government has the power to do that. there are some other classifications that we can. Everybody okay? Good. Making the wall shake. Wow. There are a number of classifications that the government uses. For instance, if you are a smoker, which I hope none of you are, but if you are a smoker, then you pay certain taxes that non-smokers don't pay. And that is something that the government has deemed reasonable discrimination. If you are heading off to college next year and you're looking at institutions that you want to give your money toward, you'll find that in-state colleges are going to offer you a better rate than out-of-state universities would offer. And that is considered reasonable discrimination. They can discriminate based on your location. And the government said, that's fine. The Constitution would support that. Now, when we are dealing with these issues and when it goes to court, we have to look at it through the lens of the rational basis test to determine if the classification is considered reasonable or rational. So the question is posed, does this classification, or if you want to use the word discrimination, does it bear a reasonable relationship to some proper government purpose? Can the government justify this, and can they give a good reason why they are discriminating or they are classifying people? If the answer is no, then the Supreme Court or court system is going to say that that is not reasonable and you can't continue to do that. But if they figure, okay, well, it seems to be reasonable, then certainly they're going to continue to allow it. And so when it gets to the Supreme Court, they're going to use the strict scrutiny test with important cases of discrimination, knowing that the Supreme Court is going to set a precedent moving forward, and they know that other courts are going to rule in a similar fashion. And so they're going to be much more careful and implement not only the rational basis test, but also this strict scrutiny test to then determine whether or not discrimination has been violated. And so they're going to look at three areas here. First of all, does it involve a fundamental right? Is the case in question regarding a fundamental right? Typically, a First Amendment freedom is going to be involved here in order for the Supreme Court to hear this case or to make a ruling on it. They will also consider the case if it involves a suspect classification. And when we use the word suspect classification, put that in quotes because obviously that is that's opinion-based. But if it throws up a red flag, when you see it and it's based off of somebody's gender, so we go back to the whole bathroom issue in North Carolina, that was a suspect classification. Okay, we got some questions about this one. That's when they're going to bring that up to the Supreme Court, and the court is then going to look over that very carefully. They may also look at national origin, if they are discriminating based off of individuals. And this is where people have brought up Donald Trump and his travel ban. They have said, well, the Supreme Court needs to look at this because they believe, those that are arguing that the travel ban is unconstitutional, that it's a suspect classification, that they are picking out certain nationalities or religious groups that violates the Constitution. So the government has to prove that they have a compelling interest to justify its actions in order for them to continue this practice. And so that's the only way that it's going to survive this strict scrutiny test. Now, as we look at segregation in America and the way that it has happened in the past, we've had the Jim Crow laws. So how did the Jim Crow laws allow segregation? How did Jim Crow laws? Can they? Okay, that separate but equal is definitely part of that, and so that allowed them to kind of get around the laws. But what are Jim Crow laws that in and of themselves? When you see that term, what should your mind think of? Laws that are intended to do what?
To separate separate, like to take to separate from like colors and the color and the white and make it balanced.
So the Jim Crow laws were ways that and most of these were in the South, ways that people were justifying discrimination. They were specific rules, specific laws to keep people separated and to get around the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So the Jim Crow laws still allowed for this to keep going on, and so it goes to the Supreme Court, and in 1896, we are 30 years past the Civil War at this point. 30 years later, it goes to the Supreme Court, and they're challenging the Jim Crow laws. And they are saying that, the laws that are allowing segregation to continue are unconstitutional. The Supreme Court rules in Plessy versus Ferguson, what famous ruling? What did they say? What's the statement that comes out of this? Separate but equal. Okay, maybe that was too easy and everybody knew it and just made that assumption, thought it was rhetorical. Separate but equal. Okay? I'll turn the screen too, by the way. So that means that we have to have equal facilities for blacks and whites. And as long as they're equal, then it's okay to have these Jim Crow laws and it's okay to have segregation. And this continues on for about 60 years in our country, to where we allow for this to go on. What was the problem with separate but equal? Well, they're separate, yes, so it's dividing our country. But what was the physical problem with separate but equal? Not equal at all. It was separate, but it was rarely equal. And so many of the people in the black community said, well, yes, we have a separate restroom or we have a separate dining room in this restaurant, but it's like a shack. You know, it doesn't function well. There's no heat. There's no air conditioning. It's a terrible place to be. And so eventually this gets overturned in 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education. So there was a young girl who wanted to go to school, and she didn't believe that her parents didn't believe that the school was providing a similar education, and so she wanted to go to white school. And the school, of course, said no. We have every right under Plessy versus Ferguson to send you to the black school, which had inferior teachers, inferior curriculum, was not a high-quality education. Goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, you know what? They're right. This is not being done equally, and so in Brown versus Board of Education, the ruling was that you could no longer segregate even if you're trying to make it equal, because it's not really equal. So it outlawed segregation. It overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, and it began the momentum toward the Civil Rights Act in 1964. So in 1964, this particular act denied federal money to any county, city, state that was still practicing segregation. So if you still had the Jim Crow laws in effect, or if you still had separate but equal, and you were not making an effort to change that, then you lost your federal funding. Well, that's a big deal if you're dealing with public schools. And so then we have this legal terminology that begins to show up in the court system. It's called de jure or de facto segregation. And de jure segregation is segregation by law. So segregation by law had been eliminated. So the law states that segregation is no longer allowed. That's de jure segregation. But in fact, or de facto segregation, really had not ended segregation in practice. It was still happening to some extent. People were still finding ways around it. And the government had to make a decision here. Is the government responsible for de jure or de facto segregation? De jure. Why do you say de jure? What do you think, Nathan? Why not de facto?
Because that's segregation that's going on separate from the government, but de jure was the laws that have been set in place that allowed for segregation.
Okay, so the government has done its job by changing the laws of the land. Who's responsible to enforce it? Well, according to our knowledge of the Constitution, whose job is to make the laws? Legislative branch. Whose job is to enforce the laws? It's executive branch. And that's why you see a number of presidential actions to get involved in segregation issues. Now, I would tend to agree that the de facto segregation is more of the citizens get on board with it. They need to make the right decision to follow and honor the spirit of the law. If we start having government control and forcing people into that, it starts putting further restrictions. So that's probably a higher debate for another day that we don't have as much time to talk about today. Typically, when government gets involved in de facto segregation or de facto issues, it's not a very popular issue. Fast forward to today with the whole national anthem controversy, it is not very popular, or it would not be a very popular thing if the government were to mandate that we are all to stand during the playing of the national anthem. That many people believe that is going too far. Now, when it comes to federal civil rights laws,